and that is welcome. It's really great to see you here, and I thought Daryl did a really nice job for us to set the stage. I also think it's important that we feel like it's a safe atmosphere, and we can ask and discuss any of the resource concerns that we have on our farms, or ranches, or gardens, or orchards, all of those things. So I think that's important to have that kind of atmosphere. I don't want any harassment from you guys sitting behind me. I can hear that. You can see how this is going to go. First of all, I think we should set the stage by saying I think we should be able to farm forever. I think that should be our goal. How do we farm forever? I think also I really appreciated today's presentations when you see organic systems and you see no-till systems, you see all these systems moving toward moving towards soil health principles. And I think that's so important because I think that's how we farm forever. We build soils back, we regenerate, we do all those things. So Lauren got us off to a high energy start this morning, and he talked about the connection of a living plant. We all saw his material and how it started out, and then we saw how he started to add and how he started to harvest more and more carbon. And I thought that was really interesting. So the carbon sink timeline and the overlap of crop diversity put it in perspective for us, and we appreciated that. Then he handed off the baton to Jeremy Wilson and tests that no longer correlate with anything. I've seen that. I've monitored soils most of my career, and I've spent a good part of it looking at things going, I don't know exactly why that happened. But I think as we were so used to things being a bit degraded, that when they started to improve and we started to apply principles, we started to see these changes, and it was the old 1 + 1 is no longer 2. Jeremy also explained to us water-stable aggregates and infiltration rates. That's a great basis to start from. If we achieve those, good things follow. Then when Chris talked, and I was able to take notes through the entire talk and stay with her at the end as well. I never missed a word in my notes. I don't know if the rest of you were able to. You can get my notes later, okay? But Chris talked to us about building a community and connecting with others. What do you think we're doing today? We're building a community and we're connecting with others. And I think that's really important. And we're running out of time and money. Some people might also add we're running out of health. So all of these things start to come together. Genetically programmed for conservation of resources to be efficient. And sometimes, as I think Dwayne Beck would say, the devil's in the detail. And I think that's one of those details that the more we think about that in terms of our systems, the more we start to understand. Then we had Blaine and Ken Schmaltz, stresses in the family. And I think a lot of times those are things that we adjust to and then things that we make work. And what were the three words that started with an F? Faith, family, and farming. And I think that's a pretty good spiritual journey as they explained it. I also appreciated the comment about weeds help chart our course. But that's because you observed them. So many times we don't stop to observe, but they observed them. In addition to the full impacts of a season-long cover crop. And then Russell, first-generation farmer, right? Yeah. That's amazing. He didn't talk like a first-generation farmer, did he? He did not talk like a first-generation farmer at all. Quit, guys. I heard that comment behind me. They said it was the whiskey, and I don't know. I liked the comment about the home run mix before the corn. I thought the tracking of the carbon, water extractable organic carbon, gives you something to track in terms of food in your system. That's pretty darn good. That lets you know what's happening, maybe what isn't happening. Carbon-nitrogen ratio target was 40:1. Gets you kind of in the middle there. It's not an 80:1 like wheat would be. It's not maybe a high 20s, 29 or so for like soybean would be. It's got about a 40:1, so he's kind of found that sweet spot where his system seems to flourish. Then two, we got to Mr. Newport. Root growth stoppage versus recovery time. How much recovery time are you willing to give it? So if you take more material off, are you willing to give it the more recovery time? And all of a sudden, you start to come together with something that balanced. I like the comment about balancing animal performance with forage and land improvement. That's a day's workshop. That one sentence is a day's workshop, because we've seen people do this. And I think the brand of cattle that survives in your environment, are they the ones that survive in your environment? And I think there's a lot of things to be said for that, because you can take cattle from some other place and they may or may not fit your environment. So we look at that. Johann Zietzman, I had the opportunity to sit down with he and his wife Brenda. My wife and I had a good visit with him one evening over dinner in Bismarck about branded cattle that survive in your environment and how to create that. And he talked about things like closing a cattle herd. Well, in the U.S., you can't do that, right? You can't do that. You can't close a cattle herd. You still got to bring in bulls. And he would look at you and go, no, you don't. Here's what you need to look at. And so just a real fascinating individual, and we appreciate Alan putting together those concepts. So with that, I want to open this up to questions. And I have one written question that I'm going to lead with. And we'll see who would like to take that one. Does everyone have a microphone or share one within reach? Okay, we're good. We're good. So the first question is, why is Florida not showing degrading? Why is Florida not showing degrading, and Canada? Hope I got that question right. It's in relation to Florida and Canada and degrading soils. So who had that information? Was that Chris? Chris, you want to tackle that one? So there are some thought regarding Florida versus Canada, or Florida and Canada.
Well, the hot zones thing that I talked about, Canada, those areas of Canada, you did see there were quite a bit of degraded areas in Canada. So Canada's not escaping the degraded areas. But there are some areas of Canada that aren't degraded, and that's because the soil is frozen most of the time. So you don't have that level of degradation. And in Florida, you don't have the same level of degradation in some of those soils. And that is because most of Florida is basically flat and sandy and pretty much at sea level. And so what ends up happening is you don't have that same level of degradation that you're having in that area. It doesn't mean that it's not degraded, it's just not as degraded as the rest of the landscape is. So you don't have the runoff that you have in a lot of the other areas. So that's kind of the simple answer there. Anybody else have more they want to add to that?
We give the opportunity for anyone else to contribute. Okay. Thank you, Chris. With that, we're going to open it up to questions from the floor. I think Brandon's got a microphone over here. Daryl's got one over there. So, okay, Daryl, if you want to start with that individual.
Go ahead. I guess this is a question for Chris. I was just wondering if you could touch on the effect of glyphosate on mycorrhizae fungi, both the living fungi and the spores, and maybe some management practices for managing that.
So when we're looking at the impacts of glyphosate on mycorrhizal fungi as well as other microorganisms, research is starting to show that there is an increasing impact on the mycorrhizal fungi. What we are seeing is that the same way that glyphosate affects plants, it affects the metabolism of the mycorrhizal fungi as well, because it's not inert in the soil, it's actually robbing micronutrients from the soil and from the interactions with the microbial communities. Glyphosate is a strong chelator. It also was originally listed as an antimicrobial because it interacts that way, and so it does have a very, that's how it was originally classified, so it does have a very degrading effect on microbial communities. Now the research, again, the research and the research data is very limited on exactly what's happening with glyphosate, other than sort of some generalities that exist about what's occurring with glyphosate and how it's interacting. One of the things that we're also finding with glyphosate as well is that the GMO plants, and when plants are treated with glyphosate, but even if you're not utilizing glyphosate and the plants are just genetically modified to be treated with glyphosate, what happens is that reduces the amount of sugars that could be available to feed the microorganisms. And so it can reduce the overall microbial populations because they're not being fed. And so you get a reduction in microbial communities from that standpoint. So there are several different ways in which that could be interacting and reducing microbial populations overall.
Anyone care to add to that comment? Okay, Brandon, we can switch over to this half of the room. Question on this half.
I'm concerned about empty calories that you spoke about earlier, Chris. I believe that the foods, we've got evidence that they don't have the same nutrients that they had 40 years ago. And I'm just wondering, is there a connection to our dependency on glyphosates? I understand that glyphosates were first introduced as a way to stop heavy metals in burning incinerators, and then they realized the grass is dying around the plants, so maybe we can use it to kill plants. So is that the reason why these plants can't take up these nutrients, because all these metals are being tied up in the soil?
Well, overall, we're seeing a decline in the nutrient density in our crops, in our plants, and a lot of that does have to do with the microbial communities and the decline in the microbial communities. So we're not getting the micronutrients that are being bioavailable and being translocated into the plants, whether that's happening because of those micronutrients are being chelated and bound up by things like glyphosate, or just because the microbial communities are declining. Both of those things are having an effect. The other thing that happens is what we're ending up with is the plants, when we have selected for varieties of plants to be highest yielding, what ends up happening is the plants, as they're selected for highest yielding, they will automatically increase to be larger or to make more grain. They will stuff more carbohydrates in there because that's what they have in abundance. And it means that there's less sugars to be allocated and exuded out of the roots, and there's less root mass overall, so we get a lot less microbial activity, and we don't get as much micronutrients that can get into our plants. In addition to the micronutrients, though, one of the key things that we're starting to see that is missing in our food is not just the micronutrients that Russell sort of mentioned, but he also mentioned some issues that we're seeing with amino acids, with vitamins, with phytochemicals, with antioxidants, and a number of other things, some of which are made solely by microorganisms that are no longer effectively working with the plants, and so we're missing those from our food.
Any additional comments from anyone in the group?
I'll add a historical subnote.
Please.
If you look at those data, the decline began, I don't know, they started recording in World War II era, that time frame. And glyphosate became a major product in our crop systems 96 to 99, somewhere in there, and ever since. So just a historical subnote.
Okay, Daryl, let's take a question on your side.
Does anyone have one over here?
I have one over here, I guess.
Jay, can I make a comment on that last question? So in visiting with, and I've worked with quite a few plant breeders, and when they want to control the outcome of the breeding lines that they work with, the two minerals that they work with are magnesium and phosphorus, because those are the fertility control. And so they actually work to reduce those numbers so that they can control the outcome of the plant when they try to do some genetic engineering. So I don't know if you guys are all aware of that, but those magnesium and phosphorus, just like it is when you're raising a, when a woman is pregnant with a child, those are the fertility controllers. So.
I got one here, Jay.
Okay, Daryl.
Jeremy and Lauren, you guys talked about sowing companion crops with corn at kind of like V4, and I was wondering if why you waited till V4 and didn't go earlier, and you didn't mention that. Do you graze those off, or do you just straight zero till in your next year's crop after that, or how do you handle that?
Did you get that?
Yeah, we're looking at getting some water in place, and then fencing those cornfields, and then we're also looking at adding rotational grazing into our system. So we're really excited to implement those practices. So that's going to be in our future. And why do I wait until V4? I think corn seems to be, in our neck of the woods, a little bit slow going up until that, between V3 and V4. And if we get it out there too early, some of those cool season components of the mix that are kind of meant for the fall, they just may get in the way of our corn production. And as long as we're going to be focused on corn production, we're going to try to make sure that's not going to be a problem. Now, if we wait just a little bit, we'll still have a good germination, but then that corn canopy will close up just over the cover crop, and if it's not big enough and have a large enough root structure, it will just die off. So if we go out at V5 or 6, there's not much there in the fall, and then summer growth is nil. So that timing window seems to be about where we want to be, and we haven't been on the early side of that yet. We've been on the late side of it, and we definitely don't like that. So I think that we're pretty close to where we need to be, and we'll continue to look at that. I said we're pretty new to this, so thank you. Good question. Here's Lauren.
Some of the early research I was doing, I met with Quebec folks that are actually putting the interseed cover crop down with the planter. So it's going to be site-specific, your timing. The farther north you are, the stage is going to change drastically. It's kind of neat that Jeremy and I are probably 200 miles in latitude difference, but we're generally in the same stage. But then as you go east, it's a lot warmer growing season. I think that's why some of them are doing the V1, V2. Some of them are even pre-emerge. I know Chris Teachout, a friend of mine, he is actually running what he calls a primer cover crop. He's putting in his cover crop in before he plants the corn. He'll terminate a part of it, but then the cover crop is there. As far as the grazing aspect, that's kind of where we were starting to go with the 60-inch corn. If you're truly going for biomass, that is something you're going to want to look at. There's getting a lot of data going to start coming out this year on some of that. We kind of stumbled upon it by blind dumb luck last year. That was kind of our fail plot last year, because we've been working with tram line plots for the last 4 years, and we started noticing the cover crop in the tram lines every year was significant. We had significantly more biomass. So then as we were setting up the plots for last year, we started reasoning out, and my mindset was, I was looking at bringing sheep in to graze as soon as the corn got tall enough where the sheep wouldn't bother the corn. The little caveat I have is, I told you earlier, I had a little bit of an accident. I can't be around livestock anymore, so I'm trying to work with people to do the grazing. And this year we had it set up, but the day I started seeing we were going to start getting the fence in, that I seen coyotes and fox, And I was working with a 4-H kid, and I didn't want to risk his livestock. So, you know, we backed off on that. But I know there's quite a few guys. I think Bob Recker, he's going to be at the No-Till Conference this year. Be paying attention to that one. He's kind of the research guy that I've been working with the last couple of years. I think he's got 35 cooperators this year. So there's going to be a lot of data come forward after this year. A lot of, you know, I know there's a lot of good plot work being done this year. So be focusing on that, I guess.
Can I just add something quick too? One of the things that you might want to be paying attention to as well is looking at optimizing your cover crop with corn for when the plant, the corn has its nutrient demand stage. So at, you know, somewhere between V7 and V10 is when the corn wants its greatest nutrient demand. And if your cover crop, if your companion crop can actually help to supply that at its greatest level, that can also be beneficial overall to your yield. So looking at how you're going to be able to optimize the whole companion type of a relationship. So as you're looking at these different types of companion crops, what are the issues you're trying to address most? Are you looking for grazing? Are you looking for fertility? Are you looking for weed management? Are you looking for all three? How are you, that can help you choose your companion crops, as well as timing for when your companion crops may be in there.
I'll set up the question for tomorrow with Dr. Jonathan Lundgren. I had the luxury of presenting at his place this summer. He has a great intern that is doing some great research on interseed cover crops. The best way he describes, the question came up this morning, was about the bugs and stuff like that. The flypaper effect is what they're starting to see. As that bug comes in to land on your crop, instead of having a solid canopy to land on, all the different color spectrums are messing with the bug's mind, and that they have to exert more energy and stuff like that. So I kept thinking of that, and I wanted to make sure that one gets addressed for tomorrow. Lundgren will be the one to ask on some of that.
Any other speaker comments? Brandon, back to your side.
Okay, I have a question for Mr. Schmaltz out of Rugby. You're a seed dealer, and you also said that you are working with the plant industry and the plant pathologists. How do you keep your acres separated if you do organic?
We are actually doing the seed production on the organic, if that answers your question. I had prior experience before I became organic doing seed production. So I had working relationships with the seed certifiers, a lot of plant breeders. I'm not sure that answers your question, but one thing I will tell you is why do I do it? Because there are a lot of breeders in this country that are retiring or have been forced to retire, and they have a lot of work they have never been able to do within the institutions, and they are willfully coming to people like myself and offering their services. And so it's pretty interesting. I have 4 working with me currently, so I don't know if that answer any part of your question there. None that have retired out of NDSU at this point. I have 1 out of Idaho, I have 2 out of Minnesota, and I have 1 out of South Dakota.
Very good. Daryl, back to you.
Yeah.
I have a question for Russell. When you look at your organic nitrogen levels in your Haney test, how can you determine how much of that becomes plant available during that current season? And then when you look at different climates or locations, how does that change in your area in the south compared, let's say, for here in North Dakota?
So to answer the question, when we send a test, we work directly with Rick's lab. There's other commercial labs that do his test as well. And the way that they're making the nitrogen recommendation isn't solely based off of what they're seeing organically. They're looking at the CO2 burst, the respiration rate, which gives them I guess a snapshot or indicator of what the biology is doing in the ground, how active it is. And so when they make their recommendation, that is their recommendation of whatever it is on that paper of what that season will see. And like I said before, if you go into a drought, a flood, some kind of weather change that's other than what you would see in a normal season, you have to retest. When we went into a drought and only had 4 inches of rain, typically by, July, when we're looking to top dress, we've only got half the amount of residue that we did at planting time. It didn't look like any of that residue had broken down. So we just, we resampled. When we sent it back in, they actually changed their recommendation by about 30 units. And we added 30 units at top dress. We left a check strip just to see the difference, and they were correct. We did need to increase it. So, when Rick makes those recommendations, I guess they're truly never given 100%, because what they're doing is they're taking that snapshot at that time with 3 different indicators on what's going to be available that season. So it's a pretty good indicator. Was there another part of that question? So how they change it based on location and climate. I guess that's the good thing about Rick's test that I've understood is by using root exudates in water, it's exactly what the ground's seeing. It doesn't matter what part of the country you're in. And you just understand that, I guess as you move north and you get full ground freeze, the biology in the ground, the temperatures need to be probably 55 and warming. So if you're taking a sample, say when you're barely getting out of ground thaw, it'll probably be a different sample as if you were to wait until you had full thaw and 55 and going up, because you're going to see more activity. But essentially he's just reading the biology in the ground. So climate is only going to change that and affect that with the temperature, depending on the time in which you pull the sample. Anybody?
I was just going to say that, you don't want to, this isn't something where you're going to take the sample the fall before and have that be your indicator. This is something that you want to take the sample the spring of. So, because it is looking at the biology and the activity, and it's taking into account, the organic carbon, the organic nitrogen, the microbial activity, all of those types of things. And just like everything that we do, and what I was trying to say before is we know so little about what actually is really going on, especially with the biology, and we know so little about it when it comes to, the real chemistry of what's going on in chemical-based systems. This is really a shot in the dark. But what we are trying to do is work with more of an understanding of a biogeochemical environment. And this is giving us information that taps into that in a better way than just a chemical environment does.
Any other speaker comments on the question? Okay, Brandon?
Yeah,
we're going back to you.
I'm intrigued about adding livestock to, I'm a grain farmer, and it seemed like livestock is a little bit foreign to me, but, and being from Canada, my question has to do with the Southern Plains and how in Oklahoma, Kansas, I've always heard that they're grazing winter wheat or anything out there. And I'm wondering if you know of if there's less soil degradation in these systems with the use of grazing winter wheat in these places, and that anybody on the panel there.
Okay, so you're asking if there's less degradation in a winter wheat system than in typical farm ground here, or did I misunderstand?
Well, historically, it seemed like that's a system that they've been implementing for a long time out there. So it would have, the question would be, is there the soil health better in these systems? That kind of stuff.
All right, I'm going to answer it this way, and you tell me if it's not satisfactory, okay? The grazing itself is generally beneficial, although wheat grazing is typically done on a wide open basis. If I have a quarter section that's all wheat ground, I would dump out a set number of cattle based on where I lived and what my historical stalking rate would be on that wheat, and based on what moisture I had, okay? That's typically how it's done. So it's an irregular pattern of fertilization you get from the cattle, but there's a thing called the Magruder plots at Stillwater, Oklahoma, at Oklahoma State University, and they have been in operation as a measuring tool on continuous wheat since statehood, which was 1907, actually since before statehood. And they did not add chemical nitrogen. Well, they tried it, but they did not find that chemical nitrogen made any difference in productivity until mid-50s. I'm going to say 55. That's not the right year, but somewhere in there. So it was a long, slow decline in the quality of the wheat ground. It's continuous wheat on wheat, which is what a big part of Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas are, wheat on wheat. So I think the degradation is a given, and I don't know that the cattle in traditional use make much difference. They may, but because you're tilling, I think you're going to lose a huge percentage of anything you gain through the cattle. That'd be my answer.
So in part of your question, I harvested through the Great Plains in basically Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. And it just so happened that all but one of the farms that I harvested on from the mid-70s to the latter 80s, they were all grazed by cattle. And I can tell you, some of you probably would know the variety, but we had the old Scout wheats when we started. They were hard thrashing. They were limited on yield. But my comment about my experience in that timeline period of 15 to 20 years is that they, even with the new genealogy and breeding in wheat, they have no higher yield now today on the average than they did back then with the older wheats that had limited capacities. We cut 50, 55 bushel wheat all day long back in the mid-70s, later 70s. And they work really hard right now to get up to that on a farm average. So that's my comment on that.
Any other speaker comments on that? Typically when that grazing occurs of wheat, it's first of all, the wheat's in a very low carbon stage. Right, it's a system that favors the animal, not the soil. And you're probably not returning half of that material to the soil by trampling. So, you know, it's a little different than, I think, the grazing we've been talking about today, to expect those kind of impacts in a positive manner. So, Daryl, I think we're back on your side.
Jeremy, tell me about your chickpea flax. I know this was a really tough year for such things. I had trouble too, but I didn't get to hear much about that.
Well, thank you for the question, Lana. That's because I didn't talk much about that. I've never grown chickpeas before. It's a little different animal than I'm used to. I had a field where I thought they'd do well. I've had edible beans in there before, and it seemed to do well. So we set it up after spring wheat, stripper cut stubble, and we laid out some rye cover crop in 2 rows, and then we had two rows of cover crop that would winter kill. So there's a paired row set up every 30 inches. We put the 2 rows of chickpeas out at 15 inches, and then we had a row of flax out every 30 inches. So basically we have 30-inch flax that made somewhere around that 17 bushel. When we get it cleaned up, we'll have the exact weigh up on that. The chickpeas, they did really well. I don't think our climate's quite right for that plant. It wanted to keep growing, and it just set pods. And as the summer went on, we don't get really dry enough, I guess, to end its life cycle, like where they're commonly grown. So these kabulis, they took off as soon as it started cooling off mid-August. And they set just as many pods as we had set in the first part of the summer. So that put us in a funny spot. And then when it cooled off even more, then they decided not to fill the pods. So once the snow melted off of them, because of our awesome fall, we found half the pods had spilled out, and the rest of them were of very poor quality. But we've got some flax to sell.
Do you want some Springer cattle to graze on them?
We're going to do it again next year. I've got another chunk lined up, and the cover crop is in and growing. What hasn't winter killed already. And we're pretty excited about it again. It's a pretty neat combination. So is there anything else I can comment about that on for you? Stop down next year and you can walk them.
Okay, we're going to take one question from each side. So in other words, we're going to take two last questions. So Brandon, we want you to find the highest IQ person on this side. Then that person can ask the question. I see Rocky's trying to give back yeah, you're right on the line. And then we'll take one from Daryl after that. So our last two questions for this group. So go ahead, Rocky.
I have a lighthearted question for Chris. You gave a very good description of what happens biologically within a healthy soil profile. If I was to take and run a plow through your system, do you have anything left to talk about?
If you were to run a plow through my system, would I have anything left to talk about? If you were to run a plow through my system, I would have things left to talk about because the system, a healthy system, has a lot of resilience to it, and it can take a while to destroy it, and we've seen the evidence of that, and we're still living on the evidence of that. We haven't completely destroyed our resource, but we're working really hard at destroying it. And so, you know, we can work really hard at regenerating it too, and building it back up. So, again, we've got a very good, resilient system that we can build back up. The fungal networks have been a thing that I've spent most of my career looking at. They're very fragile, but they are also very adaptable and very willing to come back into the system. And if you manage it correctly, they are very willing to thrive. And from what I've seen most is that one of the biggest characteristics and one of the most important things is to keep the system fed. And food is a lot about growing cover crops, growing companion crops, and the things that Lauren was talking about of harvesting carbon as much as possible. And that's why I said, you know, keeping something there, keeping things green and growing. Growing degree days shouldn't matter. You should be here at least 280 days. You should have something growing on the soil here. Those types of things, that's going to be more responsive than if you took a plow through it. Tillage is an important thing for habitat, but again, if you treat the soil like you want to treat yourself, you're not going to be happy being homeless, Rocky, but you could survive. You won't survive very long without getting fed.
The simpler answer to that one on the low IQ side would be imagine Chris with a hiccup. Every time the plow goes through, she hiccups.
Still a food and home. It's food and home. Mr. Oswald, if you want to take our last question of the day.
You bet.
In the last break, we had discussion, is there a coating or a polymer available to apply to a cover crop seed so that it could be seeded with the regular crop but delay germination, much like the fertilizer industry has some coating?
We looked into that about 7, 8 years ago. The biggest thing we ran into was they were worried about the heat treat when they set the polymers, affects the germination on the seed. I think Dwayne has tried some of that now, and I know there's people working on the clay ball, stuff like that. I know when we were in France this year, the biggest thing they were talking about over there is the clay balls, and I think Argentina has taken into that. You basically broadcast the seed. with a clay ball, and then you roll your cereal rye or whatever on top of it. Zero contact seeding is what they were calling it. So there's interesting things happening on that front. Be paying attention, but I think the polymer side is going to be much like the seed, the seed coat in corn. The company went broke. There's probably a reason. So.
If I can follow up on that, I don't mean to follow up on everything, but if I can follow up on that, the Noble Foundation is working on utilizing CRISPR technology. It is there's a lot of debate as to if it should be GMO technology or not GMO technology, but it is a genetic manipulation technology, and they're looking at that with cover crops, not so much with cash crops. They want to put it into cover crops where they can basically look at manipulating the genome of various types of cover crops in order to get them to delay germination or to be able to be more frost tolerant or those types of things. So that is also something that's kind of coming down the pipe as well, as far as looking at different types of technology rather than something like seed coating or other things like that.